Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're here for Apex for Admins, building on the basics. So we're really excited that everyone could join today, and let's get to it. It would not be a Salesforce presentation without our safe harbor slide. So please make all purchasing decisions on Salesforce based on currently available technologies. So if we do talk about any forward-looking statements, please do not let that influence any purchasing decisions. So my name is LeeAnne Templeman. I am a developer evangelist with Salesforce. I've been with Salesforce about 5 years, and I was previously a Salesforce admin. I'm learning to code with David Liu, and so we're joined by David today. David has an incredibly impressive resume. He is a technical architect at Google. He's a Salesforce MVP, and he also is the creator of sfdc99.com, which is where I'm learning to code, and it's a phenomenal site for admins and declarative developers learning to write triggers and to write Apex. Good morning, David.
Good morning, guys. It's great to be here. Thanks for all the messages. Really like the ones where you guys are taking our code and repurposing it and writing your own triggers. That's great to hear, guys.
Awesome. So, especially for those who are joining on the recording, please engage with us in the community, engage with the Salesforce developer community, and here's a few ways that you can, a few channels. At Salesforce Devs is the Salesforce developer Twitter handle, and for this webinar series, Learning with David, the hashtag Apex for Admins hashtag on Twitter is a great way to reach out to us. So again, especially those of you who can't participate in the live Q&A at the end, hashtag Apex for Admins, we are tracking that hashtag really closely. We want to hear your success stories about writing your first trigger. We want to hear any questions you have. We want to hear feedback. So we're really excited to talk to the community. At Facebook, Salesforce developers, and also the success community. So we're going to talk quite a bit about the communities on both the success community and the developer community forums. Great places to engage with the community with questions that arise from this webinar or things that you're working on, things that you're learning. And this webinar will be recorded and posted to the registration page. It usually takes about a week. And if you have not had a chance to listen to last week's, it'll be at I'll share the URL for that as well. So if you have questions during the course of this webinar, don't wait till the end to ask. As those questions come up, in the GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar control panel, there is the chat window. Go ahead and ask the question there. We do have a team here to answer questions. If we don't get to your question, we will. We're going to try really hard to get to all of the questions, but we are going through a lot of code content today. So if we don't get to it right during the live Q&A or in the live chat, we are going to be going through the questions. And also tweet us. Again, hashtag Apex for Admins. It's a great place to ask those questions to us as well. And we're going to do live Q&A at the end. So we're going to have this webinar runs about 45 to 50 minutes, and in the last 10 minutes or so, we are going to go through some of those live questions as well. And again, the developer forums. So developer.salesforce.com/forums. It's a great place to learn about more tools in your coding journey. It's a great place to see what other people are writing. It's a great place to connect with experienced developers like David. David, how many posts do you have on the developer community?
4,000 posts.
4,000 posts. That's amazing. So it's a great place to engage with the community as well, with the dev community. So I mentioned that David said he has 4,000 posts, but he also has some top tips. So if you are learning to code, for all of our admins learning to code, David, if you joined last week, you know that David is a self-taught Salesforce developer, and he's landed his Force.com developer dream job. But he is a self-taught developer with zero programming background. So I love to hear David's tips on how to learn to code yourself.
All right, guys, I want everyone to know that you can do it. Anyone can code. I'm not super smart. I'm just your normal guy, and I learned to code, and so can you. In fact, you can learn how to code any trigger by the end of summer. And here are my top tips for you to do that. First, you got to join all 3 webinars. Our third and final one is next week. Not only are we giving away all the secrets, we are giving away all the prizes as well. Also, check out my site, sfdc99.com. The featured post up top is a step-by-step guide to becoming a Salesforce developer by the end of summer. All it takes is 5 to 10 hours a week. Finally, you guys got to be active in the community. It's going to accelerate your learning, and you will be inspired by other people.
So one of my favorite tips that you shared last week was making coding fun. How do you make coding fun, David?
I like to wear sunglasses when I code. I like to drink the Mike's Hard Lemonade, the good stuff. Yeah.
That's awesome. So whatever you need to do to make it fun, to make it an enjoyable experience, make it, it's your journey to learn a new talent, a new skill. And go to David's site. So sfdc99.com, it is the best place. If you don't have any programming background, it is the best place to learn Apex. This is where I'm learning Apex. This is where David has thousands of visitors to this site. He put together a really good beginner tutorial for our admin community. People who, all of you workflow wizards out there that know everything you can do on the declarative platform, the point and click platform, this is just the best place to go for learning to transfer those skills and to learn triggers, to really add to your admin toolbox and be an admin who codes.
Yep, and I also have my own Salesforce org, which all of you guys can log into. There's a link up top. You can log into the org and see and play with all the code that we have written here in the webinars and on the site.
Awesome. And also, as we go through, all of the code we're going through today will be posted here at sfdc99.com. So don't worry about taking screenshots or trying to copy down the code or the triggers that we're writing today. All of the code will be at sfdc99.com. So once the webinar is over, you can go and copy and paste that code, go through the quizzes. So definitely, once this webinar is over, this is a great place to go next to continue your coding. And also another piece of, when we talk about getting immersed in the community and, being able to really be around other developers, to ask those questions, to hear other people's learning paths, Dreamforce. So if you haven't been to Dreamforce before, or maybe you have, if you're not registered yet for this year, we do have a special code here for our audience today. Dreamforce is a great place to go and to go sit on developer sessions. So maybe you've been to Dreamforce before, but you haven't really ventured into the dev zone. Well, now that you're an admin who codes, that's a great place to go and sit in on developer tracks, to go to workshops, to get developer workbooks. And also, David, are you at Dreamforce this year?
Oh yeah, I'm going to be presenting. Looking forward to seeing you guys.
So you can go to David's presentation, you can meet David, you can tell him about all the wonderful triggers we're writing for your company. So
that would make my day. That would be awesome.
That'd be awesome. So definitely Dreamforce is a great place to go and kind of continue your learning journey. So what are we talking about today? Last week we talked about basic triggers, and we talked about why we would use Apex classes and what that looks like. And we went through and we actually wrote a trigger and we wrote an Apex class. So that's really the foundation. So if you haven't listened to last week's recording, I know we posted it yesterday. Still join today, stay on the line today, but definitely encourage you to go through the recording from last week. But this week we're going to be talking about, or today we're going to be talking about SOQL, which is the Salesforce query language. We're also going to talk about how to write cross-object queries. So again, those of you who are workflow wizards, you know that you can't action across different objects with workflow rules. So when we talk about some of the limits of the declarative platform and when is a good time to use a trigger versus using a workflow rule, cross-object queries is absolutely the answer to that. We're also going to talk about different variables in our triggers and how we would use those. And David's going to go through and write a if statement for us, and we're going to write together we're going to write a if statement trigger at the end. So here's our URL for last week. So again, those of you who haven't listened to last week's recording, I appreciate everyone's patience with getting our recording up, but this is the link up above for last week's recording. So again, if you didn't attend last week, stay on the line today, but I definitely encourage going through the fundamentals from last week, or getting started. And we get to hear a lot more about David's path in last week. So if you're interested in hearing about David's path from being a email marketer to being an amazing Salesforce developer, teaching others to code, we got to hear about that last week as well. So let's do a quick recap of what we talked about last week. So remember this color coding. I'm going to show the glossary here. So we've got our most important lines are those blue lines. So David talked about the boilerplate code. So when we want to look at what is this trigger actually doing, we're going to look at those lower lines, those blue lines. We see our Salesforce keywords in blue, so that's telling us what object we're acting on, when we're acting this trigger. We also see our variables, so we're going to talk quite a bit about variables today. And we can see our free text as well. So remember, single quotes, not double quotes. David shared with us last week his story about single quotes and double quotes. Always use single quotes for free text, and we can see our text strings here as well for send them a new free t-shirt and ultra high. So that's where we determine our text. We also wrote a test class last week. So we can go through and we see the same color coding, and we have our free text, we have our test class variables, and these are the triggers and test class that are shared on SFDC 99. So if you want to go and copy these and put them in your developer org, it's a great exercise to go through. So time for a pop quiz. We'll check and see, and in the morning on Pacific time if everyone's paying attention. How does your test class know which trigger to test? This is a trick question. It doesn't. Test classes actually indirectly trigger your trigger by causing actions that will make your trigger run. So they don't actually point to the trigger itself. So our trigger previously that we looked at on the screen was a trigger that acted every time there was a new account. And the test class actually, it didn't call that trigger, it just created a new account. And so that's how we test our triggers. So it never explicitly tells the trigger to run.
Well said, LeeAnne.
So next question, and I expect all of our admins out there to get this one right. If you can solve a business need using a trigger or workflow rule, which should you use? Awesome, I'm seeing a lot of correct answers here in the chat. You guys are rock stars. Workflow rule.
Good job, everyone.
We always use clicks whenever possible. So those of you, who are experts on the declarative platform, which is our point and click platform, whenever possible, we want to use the functionality that's provided there. It's easier to maintain, doesn't break. It's going to be subjected to new feature upgrades as we have new releases. It's less maintenance, so it's a very good idea to be familiar. This is why admins who code are such rock stars and so powerful, because you guys know the declarative platform better than anyone. So you know when you can use, forecasting. You know when you can use workflow rules, and you don't have to code for everything. But we like having that tool in our toolbox, and so we can code when we want to. What is trigger new, and why is it so important? Awesome, I'm seeing a lot of correct answers here. Trigger new is a special list of every record that's entered your trigger. So this variable is actually in every trigger that you write.
Nice.
Awesome, lots of correct answers here. Great job. So what is SOQL? SOQL is the Salesforce query language. Now we use SOQL to call records anywhere in our database. So again, those of you who've used workflow rules, there's limits to what you can look at with a workflow rule. You're limited to the record that you're viewing, the record that you're on. With SOQL, we can actually call records from anywhere in our database. So that makes our triggers really, really powerful. And we can use SOQL in a trigger. So we can use SOQL and Apex together in a trigger in order to call all sorts of records, to set our criteria. We're going to talk quite a bit about the different types of queries, but SOQL is really, really powerful for writing those cross-object actions and for having triggers that can bring up basically any record in your database for a trigger. And you may have already used SOQL. So even if this doesn't look super familiar to you today, those of you who have used the Apex data loader have actually already used SOQL. So whenever you've created a query in the Apex data loader, like for an extraction or an export, and you go through and you select your query fields, and then you're selecting the operators and what you would like the values to be, in that text box below, it actually creates a SOQL query for you. So this is kind of a query creating wizard. So there are limits to the types of queries you can create using the data loader. It's a great place to kind of get started and start to see what those different queries look like as you are using this wizard to put together different fields, different operators, look for different values, and you can kind of see all of the results or the queries, the questions that you're looking for down below. Now, there are limits, like I said, to this. Like just like with any wizard builder, there are limits to the sorts of queries you can write using the data loader, and that's why we actually want to use SOQLs. We can create our own SOQL queries and query any record in our database, in our Salesforce. So David's going to talk about the different types of SOQL queries. So these are ones that you would be able to write on your own, and we're going to talk about where you'd write them. But David, why don't you talk about the different types of queries?
All right. Guys, it's time for the best part of the day. It's time to code. We're going to be covering a lot of code, so if you have coffee nearby, I suggest you start sipping. So think of SOQL to be like the drag and drop report builder in Salesforce that you guys are all used to, except instead of dragging and dropping fields, we're typing them out with code. Before we look at these SOQL queries, let's talk about the syntax highlighting we have here. So we have blue text. Blue text means it is an important Salesforce keyword. We have capitalized text, which means it's an important SOQL keyword. And then we have the blue background, which means it is just generally an important line of code. All right, let's take a look at the first one. So every SOQL query begins with select. After the select, we have a comma-separated list of every field we want to query. Now, these are the API names of our fields and not, the regular field labels. Afterwards, we have a from, which is also in every SOQL query, and then we choose which object we are querying from. So this first basic SOQL query selects those 4 fields from every account in our database. Next, we have cross-object SOQL. Now, you know how sometimes when you're building a report in Salesforce and you want to include a certain field, but for whatever reason you're not allowed to do it, you never run into that in SOQL. Any field you ever want to query, you can bring it in. In fact, here we are querying a field 5 records away on a contact. We're getting the account, we're getting the account owner, then we're navigating to the owner's manager, and then we're navigating to the needs chocolate field on the manager. And then we have the where clause. So when you're using a report builder in Salesforce, you're often adding filters. In fact, you're almost always adding filters. The where clause is your filter, but in SOQL. And here we're adding a clause that says, find every contact that eats chocolate. Okay, moving on. Usually in your report filters, you're going to have multiple filters at the same time. And you can do this in SOQL as well. So here we have 3 filters. We have where they must eat chocolate, they can't be allergic to nuts, and they can't be in chocolate rehab. You can also use ORs, just like you can in report filters. Here we're making a SOQL query where every contact must eat chocolate, and they either have to like milk chocolate or they have to like dark chocolate. Although, we all know it goes without saying that milk chocolate is clearly superior to dark chocolate. Next, we have text, picklets, and IDs. So when you're using Apex or SOQL, it doesn't really care what kind of text field you're using, whether it's a text field, a long text field, a pickless field, or an ID field. It treats it all the same, and it treats it as text. And whenever you use text, you have to have single quotes around it. So this favorite chocolate field that we have in our filter, it could be a text field or it could be a pickless field. Also, when you're using IDs, you use single quotes around it as well, and you can use 15-digit or 18-digit IDs. Moving on to numbers, SOQL queries with numbers. These are pretty easy. You can use all the standard operators, equals, greater than, less than or equals to. Here we have a query that says find every contact that eats chocolate and has eaten more than 10 chocolate bars or has eaten less than or equal to 1 broccoli. Dates. You can also have dates in SOQL. Pro tip for admins out there, you can hard code dates in your report builder in Salesforce. You can hard code today, you can hard code yesterday, you can say next month, you can say last month. You can do the same thing in SOQL, which we're doing here as well. And then there's fuzzy matching. Oftentimes you're going to want to do a contained filter. Here we're writing a filter that says Find every contact where their preferred filling contains caramel. So whenever you're doing contains, you use like as the SOQL keyword, and then you have a string of text surrounded by single quotes. You have, notice the parentheses. Parentheses are wildcards in text. So wildcards mean you can match 0 or more characters. So we're saying this contact must have caramel as one of their preferred fillings. Finally, we can limit our results. We're going to get a ton of results, and we can say we only want 10 of them, and we can sort them. On the bottom, we're saying order by last name ASC, which stands for ascending. We can also do descending using DESC. Whoa, what's this?
It's time for a quiz. So we have a query quiz, and we actually have a developer prize package to give away. So get ready on chat, get ready to pay attention to this query. The first listener to guess what type of candy bar this final query is asking for will win a developer prize package, including, we know David loves his developer t-shirts, a developer t-shirt and a copy of Head First Java, David's very favorite book. So we haven't shown the query yet. We're going to the query in the next page, so get your fingers ready. First listener will win a developer prize package. What type of candy bar is this query asking for?
Massive SOQL query.
I see a correct answer.
Go.
Awesome. The answer, Eli. Let's see, Eli, what was the last name? Eli Goldfarb. You got the correct answer. The answer is Reese's. So stay on the chat. Send over your t-shirt size and your mailing address in that chat window. Eli Goldfarb.
Good job, Eli.
Let's see. Let's go through and see. Oh, it looks like we had a couple of good answers. Awesome. I see James Tankersley and Michael White also guessed Reese's. So actually the top 3 answers. So we've got Eli, James Tankersley, and Michael White. Please chat over your t-shirt size and your mailing address.
Good
you
job.
won a developer prize package. Great job.
Hi, James, by the way. I know him.
Awesome. So where do we use SOQL? We talked about the data loader, so that's where you can generate those simple SOQL queries. And that's a great place to kind of get started with SOQL, get comfortable with it. It's a wizard that allows you to create basic, simple queries. We can also use it within Apex. So we'll see at the end of this how to incorporate SOQL into a actual Apex query. And finally, Workbench. So Workbench at developerforce.com is a great place to kind of get started with SOQL, to go for all of your coding needs. And actually, David calls it his coding playground.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to show you Workbench. We've got the URL for logging into Workbench here if you've never logged in before. And actually, David's going to take us through and write a SOQL query in Workbench now.
Guys, if you've never used Workbench, I highly suggest you start using it. It is the Swiss Army knife of tools for Salesforce. Now, I just logged in.
With your developer edition environment.
Correct. And there's tons of things you can do here. For example, you can do data loads here. You can do SOQL queries. And you can look at the schema of all your objects in Salesforce. Right now, we are going to do a SOQL query. By the way, if there's only one reason you need to know to use Workbench, that is you never have to enter in your security token when logging in, which drives me nuts every time I use data loader. Anyways, so we're going to write a SOQL query. Go to the Queries tab, go to SOQL query. You'll see here, a SOQL query builder, just as you would if you're using data loader. But let's write our own custom SOQL query. So let's write a SOQL query on the contact object. We want the first name, last name. We're going to do a cross-object query. We're going to get the account name, and we're going to get the account industry from contact. We'll hit query. And here are all our results. Let's add a few filters. So we'll add a filter where the account industry has to be energy. Let's see what happens. There we go. Now let's sort this. So we'll sort this by last name, ascending. Remember, you can also do descending. And here in our results, everything looks great. Now let's add another filter. We're going to do a contains. So we're going to say, actually, we're going to say the first name has to start with A. So, and first name, like A, and here's a percentage sign. I believe I called it parentheses. It's a percentage sign. I'm sorry about that. So a percentage sign is our wildcard, and first name has to start with A and then have any characters after it. Bam, there we go. That is SOQL, guys, and that's almost all you need to know about SOQL.
Awesome. So time for another pop quiz. Why do 95% of triggers use SOQL? SOQL lets you do cross-object actions in a trigger. So we talked about when to use workflow, when to use triggers. SOQL allows you to query any record in your Salesforce, whereas with workflow, there's limitations to the records that you can look at. So if you don't need to use SOQL, there's a really good chance you might want to use workflow instead, because you may be acting on just the same object. You might be able to accomplish that with a workflow rule. What are the 3 places you can write SOQL? We just saw one of them. Data loader, workbench, and Apex triggers. Now there's other places you can write SOQL, but this is what we're talking about today. The data loader is where you can create kind of basic SOQL queries with that wizard. Triggers, when we write SOQL within triggers, we're going to see at the end of the webinar today, that's how you can query other records and act on them with your triggers. And workbench, so you can log into workbench just like David did and create your SOQL query there. Oops. What are 2 words that appear in every SOQL statement? Select and
Nice.
from.
Good
So
job.
every single SOQL statement will be determining what we should be looking at and what we're going to do with it, basically. So what objects we should be looking at and what we're pulling from those objects. So let's talk about Apex fundamentals. Apex fundamentals are really the building blocks of Apex. So these are really important pieces to know so you can start writing those more intricate triggers and can go further in your trigger journey. David's going to talk about trigger variables. So we saw trigger variables in our first basic triggers. But he's going to talk about the different types of trigger variables and how you determine those. Also going to talk about if statements. So if statements are really important in your coding, being able to write a good if statement and have those comparison operators. And loops. David's going to talk about loops and what those are and when we would use loops. So let's start off with trigger variables.
All right, every time I think about this, I think of something my mentor taught me a long time ago when I was learning how to code. And he said, even the most complicated code bases can be broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until finally what's left are small code blocks that can't be broken down any further. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to teach you those code blocks, those Apex fundamentals, so that you can combine them and eventually build something really great. So first off, we're talking about variables. Variables are just like field types, but a little bit simpler. There's not as many options. Now take a look at the syntax highlighting we have here. We have the blue text on the left, which is generally Salesforce keywords. Here they are our variable types. We also have green text now. These are comments. Now comments always begin with 2 double slashes, or always begin with a double slash, and you can type anything you want after the comments. Usually you write comments just to help people understand your code. Then we have purple text. These are our variable names. We can name them anything we want. And then we have orange text, which is our strings, our text. So the first one, we are creating a new string variable. We're setting it to a variable named favorite movie, which is what we're calling it, and then we're setting it to frozen. Next, we have number fields. There's two types of number fields. We have integers and decimals. Decimals, of course, are when you need decimal values. For example, if you're using currency fields, you might want to use a decimal field. And here we are creating a new decimal, calling it merchandise spend, and it is $55.20, which is exactly how much I have spent already on frozen merchandise. All of these values are 100% true. Then we have booleans. These are always true or false. No quotes needed, just true or false. We have dates as well. There's dates and date times. Dates just do the day. Date times include the day and the time of day. Now here, if you look on the right of these dates, we are using what is called dot notation to create new dates. Don't worry too much about that now. We'll cover that more in our next session, but just know that we're creating new date variables. And finally, the last one, SObjects. This one is really interesting. What we're doing is we're mixing Apex and SOQL. We're combining it. So we're creating a new SObject record of movie type. We're naming it Frozen, and then we're setting it to a frozen record, or frozen movie record from our database using SOQL. If statements are also really important. Sometimes developers joke that if you understand if statements, you basically know how to code, and that's partially true. Basically, if statements are, it begins with if, and then there are two parentheses that enclose a statement. If that statement evaluates to true, you execute the next line of code. If not, you move on to the next if or else if statement. Now, in order to understand how to create a statement that evaluates to true or false, you have to know how to use comparison operators. So up top, we have a list of comparison operators. We have greater than, less than, which should be familiar to you. And we have equals and not equals. Notice when we do equals, we're using two equal signs, the double equal signs. We're not using one. The reason why we're doing that is when you use one equal sign, you are setting a variable to a value. When you use two equal signs, you are comparing two different values and seeing if they're equal. Okay, we also have ands and ors, which are using those double symbols over there. All right, so let's walk through this if statement line by line. First off, we're checking if I have less Twitter followers than LeeAnne. If that evaluates to true, then my emotions, become crushed. If not, we move on to the next statement, which checks if I have the exact same number of Twitter followers as LeeAnne. If that evaluates to true, we execute the line of codes in between. If not, we move on to the next statement. This one is a double. We have two comparisons in one, separated by an or, which means if I have less than 1,200 followers, or if I have less than 500 tweets. So if any of those come out to true, then we execute the next line of code. Finally, we have the else. This is an optional clause that says, if all of the above is not true, then do this. By the way, while we're here, I should say, follow LeeAnne and follow me on Twitter. Otherwise, I will be emotionally crushed. Uh-oh.
Time for some more prizes. We have a trigger quiz coming up. So on the next screen, we're going to show a trigger, and we're asking you to tell us how much David spent on frozen merchandise. So the first listener to guess via chat will win a developer prize package. So we haven't shown, I see a too much answer already.
That's true.
But we have not shown the trigger yet. So I'm going to show it now. How much did David spend on frozen merchandise? What is the final value here? We're waiting for our answers.
I agree with you, Celia. Not enough.
Yes, I see a correct answer from Blake Reeves.
Good job, Blake.
We
have
a
few
top
ones.
3. So the answer is $7.99. So our top prizes go to Blake Reeves,
Drew
Drew
Benson.
Benson, and Angela. Oh, I know Angela. Angela Soberpena. So we'll take down your names and we'll make sure to get you your prizes.
All right. So why is it $7.99 and why is it not $7.99 plus $12.99 plus $200? The reason is in if clauses in that entire if statement, only one of them can catch. Only the first one catches. After that, it moves on. It skips the rest and moves on. So in this one, only the first one caught. My favorite character is Anna, so I'm going to buy the coloring book. I'm not going to buy the soundtrack, and I'm not going to Disneyland, which is fine because I already own the soundtrack. And I hear the line for meeting Anna at Disneyland is like 6 hours long, literally. Okay, next we have loops. So there are two types of loops. We have a for each loop and a for loop. The first one should look familiar to you, and what it does is it iterates across every record in trigger.new. Remember, trigger.new is a list of all records entering your trigger. So if we had a trigger on the chocolate object, what would happen is we are iterating across every chocolate in our trigger, and we're setting each chocolate to a variable called choco. Then we're doing an if statement. If this chocolate is equal to recess, then we are going to eat this chocolate. Next, on the bottom, we have a traditional for loop, which you want to use when you want to specify a loop to run a specific number of times. In this case, we want it to run exactly 100 times. Now, the way the syntax works is first, we create a new integer I. We set it to 0 or anything else we want. Then in the next statement, we say, keep running this loop while I is less than 100. And then in the third clause, we are iterating I by 1. So I++ means iterate I by 1 every time you go through each iteration. So we're going to be creating 100 chocolates, and we are going to be eating all of them. All right. Now, let's combine everything we've learned and write a semi-complicated trigger.
So again, all of the code that David's writing will be posted at sfdc99.com. So follow along with the trigger as he writes it, and then afterwards, go ahead, copy and paste it into your own developer org.
Yep. So I'm creating a new trigger, and let's add comments to our trigger this time. It's always a good idea to add a lot of comments. So let's create a trigger that creates a new op for every new account. But let's not stop there. We will dynamically set the op amount based on the account's industry and the number of employees at the account. Based on the account's industry and the employees. Also, we only want to run this trigger when it's a prospect account. Okay, so you see our boilerplate code here. It's already there. And we're just going to change the name of our trigger, and we want to run it after an account is inserted. Now we're going to have a loop. Remember, every trigger has this loop. And we're going to iterate across trigger new because there can be multiple accounts that are entering this trigger. Now, what we want to do is, first we want to check if we have a prospect account. So if a.type equals prospect, remember, use the double equal sign because we're checking if two things are equal. Also, don't forget the single quotes here. We will create a new opportunity. So opportunity O equals new opportunity. Now let's set the standard fields, standard required fields on this opportunity. So the op name equals, we're using just one equal sign. Big deal. Set the stage name, prospecting. We'll set the close date to today plus 30. We're using dot notation here. Don't worry too much about that. We're going to set the account ID to the ID of the account in our trigger. Cool. So we've created a new opportunity, but we haven't saved it yet. Now we want to dynamically set the op amount based off of the account's industry. So we're going to use an if statement here with multiple clauses. We're going to say if the industry is technology, let's set the amount to a huge amount because tech companies have way too much money. Next, if it's non-profit, we're going to give them a discount because we love our non-profits. Finally, we have an else, which captures every other industry that we haven't accounted for. We'll make it cost $5,000. Sweet. But now let's take it one step further. For big accounts, for people with more than 1,000 employees, we'll charge them double. So to do that, we'll create a new integer. We'll call it big company multiplier. We'll set it to 2. So we have an if statement. If the account number of employees is greater than 1,000, multiply the op amount by our big company multiplier. Copy, paste, and finally, don't forget to enter your op. Otherwise, nothing will save. I save it and cross my fingers. Ooh, it worked first try. Nice. All right, now let's test if this worked. So what we want to test is we'll create a new account. We'll make sure it's a prospect account. Then we're going to set it to the nonprofit industry, which makes the amount $1,000. But we're going to make it a big nonprofit, so it'll have many employees, and it'll multiply the op amount by 2. So the final result will be a $2,000 op on this account. So let's create a new account. The industry is nonprofit. The type is prospect. And the employees is 20,000. Hit save. Come on, Salesforce. Bam! Oh my gosh, it worked. Here we have an opportunity. A new opportunity is automatically created for us. Here's our name, here's our stage, and the amount is $2,000, just like we predicted, guys. Great stuff.
Awesome. So time for another pop quiz. What is single quote 2 plus single quote 2? Let's switch over and see the answers.
The answer is
22. Awesome.
Whoa, good
so
job,
why
guys.
is that? Because each of those numbers is wrapped in single quotes, which means we treat them as text. So the result is, yes, Kelly, you got it right. So the result is 22, or it looks like 22, but it is a string. Now, what is the difference between single equal sign or double equal sign?
Nice, good job, everyone.
Awesome. One equal sign sets the variable to a value, while 2 equal signs actually checks to see if 2 values are equal and will return a Boolean true or false.
So proud of you guys.
You guys are doing
looking at all
awesome.
the comments. Great job.
So let's talk about what we learned today. We went through our basic trigger recap. So we talked about what those basic triggers look like, the variables, what those Salesforce keywords are. We learned a lot about SOQL. So David taught us a lot of different queries, types of SOQL queries. We learned where we can write SOQL. So I hope everyone logs into Workbench and has fun kind of playing with SOQL queries. We also learned the fundamentals of Apex. So those building blocks that are going to help us write those really powerful triggers. So where do we start? Developer Edition org. So everyone who's registered probably already got a Developer Edition org, but you can get as many as you would like. So if you want a fresh Developer Edition org, just go to developer.salesforce.com and get a new Developer Edition org. They never expire, and they're a really great place to start playing with your triggers and to start kind of learning to write those triggers and testing them. Now, Sandbox is also a good place to start building your triggers, depending on who you are. So if you are an admin, if you do have access to Sandbox, or if your admin will give you access to Sandbox, that's a great place once you get further along with your triggers to start actually building triggers that rely on your existing customization. So when you use Sandbox, one of the great things about that is if you do have like custom fields or custom apps, custom objects, you can start to write triggers that will test how they work within your custom schema. And also, once you're ready to write production triggers, Sandbox is where you write those. So when you do have a trigger that you'd like to write for production, you write it in Sandbox, and then we can use change sets to bring that into our production org. Definitely recommend using DE, a Developer Edition org, or Sandbox, not a trial. Trials do expire, and not all trials have Apex enabled. So definitely recommend using your Developer Edition orgs. You can get as many as you'd like, and they're free to start coding. Resources. So we talked quite a bit about forums. Hang out on the developer.salesforce.com/forums area. It's a great place to go. We see there's a category for Apex code development. It's great to kind of get started there. People share really interesting code. Also, there's a lot of really experienced developers like David that share answers and share their own kind of advice and code advice. David's site, sfdc99.com. So if you had fun on those quizzes, I know I did. There's a lot more quizzes on sfdc99.com. If you click on the beginner tutorial tab, for every chapter there's quizzes, and there's a lot more quiz questions as well. So that's a great place to go kind of test your knowledge and go through at your own speed and kind of get your feet wet even more. And talk to us. #Apex for admins, especially those who are joining the recording and don't have a chance to engage on the live chat. Totally fine. Reach out to us on Apex for admins. And we've been getting a lot of success stories, so it's been awesome to hear about people writing their first triggers
Awesome.
at Apex for admins. So I think that's amazing. We're super excited to hear about that and love seeing what everyone's writing. And join us next week. So David's 3 keys for success, one of them was to join all 3 webinars. So join us next week, same time, same place, May 29th, next Thursday. We're going to be talking about principles of a good test class. So in webinar 1, we talked about what test classes are and why we would write them. We're actually going to talk about how do you write a good test class. We're going to write our own deduping trigger, which will be a lot of fun.
Very good.
And we're going to combine what we learned today and use SOQL in a Apex trigger.
Yep. The trigger that we're going to write next week is going to have an immediate impact on your org. It's going to be great, guys.
And we're going to talk more about how to become an admin who codes. So kind of his steps for continuing your coding journey and how to become a rockstar admin who codes. So let's switch over and take a look at questions, and we're going to answer some questions here. So just give us a moment.
So here's one question. In the nonprofit trigger we wrote, why didn't we just use a workflow? Great question. So the reason why we didn't use a workflow is we can't use a workflow to create new records yet. Maybe one day, or hopefully soon. So we wrote a trigger actually on the account object, and then every time an account was created, we automatically created an op on it. Here is another question. In a traditional for loop, can I make it increment by 10 each time instead of just incrementing by 1, using I plus 10 instead of I plus plus? Yes, you can. You can increment it by as much as you want. Here's another question. Can we test through the developer console? You sure can. That's pretty advanced stuff. We won't be talking about that now, but yes, you can.
So we have a question, any deployment to production examples or how to deploy? If you're building in Sandbox, the feature for that is called change sets. And so that's if you just go to help and training for change sets, and that's the name of that feature, and it'll walk you through how to determine what pieces of metadata you'd like to package and how you want to deploy them to production. So you can deploy from production to sandbox or from sandbox to production as long as the orgs are linked. That's how you can deploy that code. But the feature is called change sets, and actually it's in your, if you go into your org right now and you go into setup and you search for change sets, or you search for data management, and under data management there's change sets. There's great articles on kind of the step-by-step how to walk through that.
Here's another question. So is SOQL the only way to perform a search in Salesforce? So that's one way of looking at it. SOQL is like doing a search, but you can also look at it as running a report through code instead of using the drag and drop report builder. So if you just want to do a search in your org, you can use the drag and drop report builder. If you want to practice writing code, you can open up Workbench and write a SOQL query on it. So will this ob trigger be up on my site, sfdc99.com? Yes, that is the first thing I'm going to do today. Let's see. Someone wants a t-shirt. Very nice. Can I use SOQL for reports? Generally, if you're running reports, I would stick with the standard drag and drop report builder. But a lot of times when you're writing triggers in Apex, you are going to want to search your database for records, and that's when you use SOQL. So outside of Apex and triggers and Visualforce, you can just use the standard report builder. Otherwise, you should use SOQL. Oh, here's an interesting one. In a cross-object query using SOQL, when do you use _R and _C? So we didn't cover this today, but anytime you have custom fields or custom objects, it always ends with _C. If you are doing cross-object SOQL queries, you will use the _R notation instead. The R stands for relationship or something. So only when you're doing cross-object SOQL. Let's see. Here's a question. What's the difference between the two loops we covered? There was a for loop which looped through trigger.new, and there was another traditional for loop where we specified it to run exactly 100 times. The trigger.new loop, that is a loop that you're going to see in every trigger that loops across a list of records. You're going to use that one most often. The second one is used when you only want a trigger to run a specific number of times. In this case, we wanted to run exactly 100 times, so we used the other loop type. Where can we buy Salesforce developer gear? I'd like to get one of the t-shirts. That's a good question. I'm wondering about that too.
Well, a great place to get Salesforce swag is Dreamforce. David has a story about, I think, would you get 30 t-shirts one year?
I got literally 30 t-shirts one year at Dreamforce. I stuffed them all in my backpack. I won, I think, a couple tablets as well. And my backpack was so heavy that literally at the end of the day, like my back cracked and I fell on the ground. And I couldn't walk for weeks. Like, I have permanent back problems because I got so many t-shirts at Dreamforce one time. I'm not even kidding about this. It really happened. But I still love my free t-shirts.
So Dreamforce is a great place to get t-shirts. Also attending our developer groups. We didn't talk about developer groups today, but attending, linking up with your local developer groups. It's a great place to both meet other developers and sometimes there's swag. So generally just Salesforce and events are a great place to get t-shirts. Wonderful. Looks like there's a shout out. There's a Pittsburgh developer meetup tonight. So if you are in Pittsburgh, there's a Pittsburgh developer. Looks like there's a Pittsburgh DG tonight. That's awesome. So I think we're about wrapping up. If you didn't get to your question, take it to Twitter, please, or take it to the success community, and we'll definitely do our best to get through other questions. Thank you again so much for joining, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you guys. Love you guys.